Parliament is back, meeting the first showdown between Carney and Poilievre. Also, reaction in Alberta to the major projects list, business concerns ahead of municipal elections, plus how the province can clean up its auto insurance mess. That's all straight ahead on episode 31 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Right, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us. A lot to get to on this episode of the podcast. Coming up later on, some interviews for you. We've got Adam Legge, president of the Business Council of Alberta. Also, Alberta injury accident lawyer Mark McCourt, and we're going to talk about auto insurance and where things stand in Alberta. So all of that straight ahead. Let's start with some of the news as we kick off a new week and, of course, a new session of Parliament underway in the nation's capital. This comes at an interesting moment, of course. We've got clearly a slowing economy, slowing GDP, increasing joblessness, and the threat of tariffs and trade uncertainty hanging over our heads. We've got a government that says it intends on addressing all of that. We saw some signs of that last week with the announcement of the first 5 projects to be identified as projects in the national interest to go through this major projects office and this sort of separate track for approving and hopefully fast-tracking some of these projects. And of course, with the promise of more to come. We've also got a budget coming, maybe a little bit later than we'd anticipated, but we're still expecting that sometime this fall. And then you've got the interesting political dynamic right now, where Mark Carney, of course, is the Prime Minister. He won a seat in Parliament in the general election. It took Pierre Poilievre a little bit longer to get back to Parliament. The Conservative leader lost his seat in the general election, ran successfully in a by-election here in Alberta. And Monday was the first opportunity we had to see the two face-to-face in the House of Commons. So some pleasantries before the two got down to business. Here's the first exchange in the House of Commons question period between the Prime Minister and the opposition leader.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister mentioned how much had changed, and it's true. I look around this place, and when I left, there was a Liberal Prime Minister who was making excuses about breaking promises, running massive deficits, costs, crime, chaos were all out of control. And whereas today, we have a Liberal Prime Minister breaking promises, making excuses, running massive deficits with costs, crime, and chaos out of control. Mr. Speaker, when will the Prime Minister match the grand promises with the real change Canadians need?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I understand the Minister, or the Minister, promotion. Come on over. I understand the Leader of the Opposition was busy. He missed the largest tax cut for 22 million Canadians. He missed the cut on the GST for new homes. He missed eliminating all federal barriers to trade. He missed. I hope I'll have another opportunity to finish a very long list of what the Leader of Opposition.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
In the spirit of nonpartisanship, we are simply going to hold this Prime Minister to his own promises. He promised that he would spend less. He's already spending 8% more. He promised the budget would be in October. Now he says it will be in November, more than halfway through the fiscal year. He promised that his government would have a smaller deficit than Justin Trudeau. Instead, now we hear that it might even be double. So a trivia question. Can the Prime Minister tell us, has there ever been a Prime Minister who has successfully doubled the deficit without even introducing a budget?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
It's a trick question.
Mr. Speaker, this government is undertaking the biggest investment in protecting Canadians in the Canadian military. Doubling our investment in the Canadian military from last year when this member last sat in the House by the end of this decade. This government, there's more.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
There's a lot more debt is what there is, Mr. Speaker. A lot more debt than we ever imagined would be possible. This is a Prime Minister who said we'd have the fastest growing economy in the G7. We have the fastest shrinking economy in the G7. He said grocery prices would go down. They're going up faster than ever before. He promised to create jobs. He has the second highest unemployment in the G7. He's really reminding us all of that sign at the bar. Free beer tomorrow. But you come back the next day and the beer is still not free, and tomorrow never comes. Mr. Speaker, why is it that all of this Prime Minister's promises of yesterday turn into today's disappointments?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I think if we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7, and we will, we need to be clear. We need to be clear about the scale of the crisis we are in. We need to be clear about the scale of investment that we need. $60 billion in new projects announced last week. $200 billion in investment announced last week. $100 billion in housing investment announced just yesterday. That's the scale of what we need.
So you can tell there certainly is a different kind of dynamic than there was previously with Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister and leader of the Liberal Party. But that doesn't mean I don't think that the Conservatives are by any stretch going to give the Liberals a pass. Maybe there's more opportunity now under Mark Carney than there was under Justin Trudeau for the two parties to find some common ground. But I think there's still a lot of areas where the government is vulnerable, a lot of areas where the Conservatives disagree with policy direction, and those areas where I think the Conservatives will try to hold the government to account. Now, one of those areas is immigration. And in a way, that does kind of affect some of these other issues, joblessness or the housing situation. It's all kind of intertwined. Most recently on our podcast, we had a conversation with Michelle Rempel-Garner, Conservative Member of Parliament for Calgary-Nose Hill and the party's immigration critic. The Conservatives are calling on the federal government to scrap the temporary foreign workers program in light of all the challenges we're facing, especially when it comes to joblessness amongst younger Canadians. It was interesting, and she pointed out in that interview that we haven't really heard much from the government other than some comments from the Prime Minister. We haven't heard from the Immigration Minister or others. Now, there was some exchange in the House of Commons on Monday around this issue. It was interesting and noteworthy that the Immigration Minister didn't respond directly to any of Michelle Rempel-Garner's questions on this file, although she did stand up and respond when some questions came from other members. Here's one exchange, though, in the House of Commons on Monday on the temporary foreign workers program between Michelle Rempel-Garner and Jobs Minister Patty Hajdu.
So let me get this straight. The Prime Minister promised to grow the economy, but it's shrinking. He promised he'd create jobs, but Canadians are losing it. We're in a healthcare crisis and a housing crisis, but the Liberals still issued record numbers of TFW permits this summer. They continued to let the asylum system be abused, and they still haven't removed countless non-citizen criminals. Mr. Speaker, why does the Immigration Minister still have her job?
The Honourable Minister of Jobs and Families.
Mr. Speaker, temporary foreign workers make up less than 1% of our total workforce. In fact, this is a program where employers must demonstrate that they vigorously and actively looked for Canadian workers because Canadian workers come first, Mr. Speaker. If an employer is found to have violated this program, there are severe penalties. There is also a tip line, Mr. Speaker, so that if Canadians or any member of Parliament feels there's been an abuse, this can be reported to officials and it will be investigated.
Okay, so like I say, I think the government is still vulnerable on this issue. I think Canadians still have a lot of concerns about the dysfunction in the immigration system and whether they really trust the government to deal with that and how that's spilled over, potentially affecting the jobless situation, the housing situation. So I think those are two areas to keep a close eye on. Now, we did mention, of course, that last week we got the announcement from the Prime Minister, big announcement in Edmonton. There's a lot of Alberta flavor to this whole major projects issue, with the major projects office being headquartered in Calgary. The announcement last week was in Edmonton of these 5 projects, kind of low-hanging fruit, projects that are fairly far along in the process, but nonetheless, an idea, I guess, of what this office is going to try to do and maybe still what's to come. Right? You did have the Premier very bullish last week about her meeting with Mark Carney. She liked what was on the list that was announced Friday, but you almost got the sense from what Danielle Smith was kind of hinting at, what Mark Carney was kind of hinting at, that there's some bigger announcements still to come, and potentially a kind of grand bargain with a major carbon capture project being linked to a new bitumen pipeline to the West Coast. So maybe we'll learn more about that in the next couple of weeks, or next couple of months, I guess. Mark Carney has suggested that by Grey Cup is when we'll get the second round of announcements under the Major Projects Office. And that's an interesting dynamic, I think, here in Alberta with everything that's going on right now. I had a piece up in at the Calgary Herald, calgaryherald.com on Tuesday, making the argument that, look, Mark Carney's got an opportunity here to deliver a real knockout blow to the Alberta separatist movement, which is sort of had its moments, in the aftermath of the federal election and the frustration, I think, in Alberta that once again we voted one way and the rest of the country voted another. We decided we didn't want the Liberals running the show anymore, and that's what we got stuck with. Now, a lot of the frustration is linked to issues around the energy sector and a lot of the impact of Trudeau-era policies. And Justin Trudeau's gone for sure, but I think that a lot of frustration is still there. Now, I think, some of the diehards in the separatist movement would say that these issues or concerns go well beyond just the energy sector. And maybe that's true. But I think that's a real galvanizing issue right now for people who might be kind of on the fence or sort of kind of maybe open to the idea of separation. This looms large. So even right now, though, I think it's a real challenge to get anywhere close to 50% support for separation. And I just think that if we get that kind of a grand gesture where the federal government is prepared to support a pipeline and make some of these other changes we're hearing about, like getting rid of the emissions cap in the oil and gas sector, that would be huge. I think it would be much harder to convince those people that Canada's broken or that none of this is working for Alberta or that we need to separate. So even right now, if you can't get to 50% in a situation where you've got a new pipeline announced and you got a prime minister who would be going out of his way almost to announce this kind of a project or approve this kind of project, I think that would go a long way in Alberta. Not to mention the obvious fact here that this would be a project, assuming it gets announced at some point, that is kind of predicated on Alberta being a part of Canada. In other words, like if Alberta's going to go on its own, that this probably wouldn't happen. So it's the kind of thing that would put that project in jeopardy. And if Alberta's saying we want this, we need this, right? I think that's a pretty powerful dynamic. So hopefully that's the announcement that's coming. As much as Carney and Smith have teased it, we don't yet know for sure. Now, as for that separatist question, Premier Danielle Smith was asked about all of this at a press conference on Monday. Now, the question was predicated on something that Jason Kenney had said recently. And Jason Kenney, former premier, of course, has been pretty outspoken against Alberta separatists and the separatist movement. And some comments from Jason Kenney in an interview recently saying that we shouldn't even be having a referendum. All of this is going to be bad for Alberta, just the political uncertainty, the division in Alberta. But if it is going to happen, he's promising to be a very public voice against the separatists. Now, I think Danielle Smith's approach is different. And as she said at her press conference on Monday when asked about all of this, that what she's trying to do, and this gets back to this whole idea of convincing the federal government that we do need a pipeline, we do need to move in a certain direction on the policy side. I think she's trying to show that she can get that kind of a win and really take the wind out of the sails of the separatist movement. So that was her response when she was asked about it on Monday. But here's the Premier in her own words.
Well, this is why I'm doing everything I can to prevent a vote, because Mr. Lukasik's vote is a yes-no question. It is a separatist referendum. He may be trying to characterize it differently. But if you ask people if you want to remain in Alberta, yes or no, there are implications if people answer no. So I have been very clear that I believe in Alberta sovereignty within United Canada. I am working with the federal government to try to address what I think are significant and real grievances that have Albertans feeling frustrated. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to have a joint announcement soon, and that it'll take the temperature down on this. So I think it's just worth noting that the current referendum initiative is being done under the old rules. So the rules that the former Premier Carney had put in place, 293,000 signatures that would have to be achieved within 90 days. So it's I know that there was sort of some implication that the change has facilitated this particular referendum question. It hasn't. It's being operated under the old rules.
Now, the point of the press conference wasn't to comment on Jason Kenney or Thomas Lukaszuk or separatism or anything like that. It was actually an announcement about Alberta's driver's licenses. And this is something that the Premier, that the UCP had promised a little while ago. I think it's something really kind of aimed at their base. The idea that we need to put citizenship status on driver's licenses. Now, you might wonder why that's necessary. Clearly, there's a cost to overhauling Alberta's driver's licenses. It is that information that needs to be there. Now, they're kind of tying it in with some other stuff. There was just a recent announcement about making a new Alberta wallet, a digital wallet available to Albertans. And one of the things that could be in that digital wallet is a healthcare card. Like right now, we still have these old healthcare cards that probably for most of us are just kind of crumbling away in our wallets, our actual physical wallets. So that would be a digital option. And now that's tying in with this announcement. I think they want to put the healthcare numbers on driver's licenses too. But the citizenship thing is interesting because this has come up before in the context of voting. Look, you need to be a citizen to vote in elections in this country, municipal, provincial, federal, right across the board. There has been at times, and I think recently Calgary City Council tried to take up this mantle, maybe we should allow permanent residents to vote, or maybe just, try it out in municipal elections. But that was a non-starter. Ultimately, that's the province's call, and the province said, ain't happening. Now, there's really no evidence that there's any kind of abuse of that. I mean, to be on the voter roll, you need to be a registered voter. You need to be eligible to vote. You need to be a citizen to be eligible to vote. And you don't even need a driver's license to vote either. Other forms of identification can suffice. So there haven't really been any documented instances of people voting who shouldn't be, at least in the sense of being non-citizens. So it's not clear that there's a problem here that needs to be solved. But it's something that you hear a lot about, this idea of election integrity. And I don't know if that's imported from the U.S. or what's driving all of that, but that seems to be maybe what's compelling the government to act here. So it was interesting when the Premier talked about the reasons why they're doing this. She mentioned a few other reasons. Here was the Premier's announcement at the press conference on Monday.
Today, we announced an important step forward on how Albertans prove their identity and Canadian citizenship, a change that will make life easier and more secure for all. Alberta is a province built on opportunity, trust, and the promise that every citizen can access the services and supports they need to thrive. Today, we're taking another step to fulfill that promise. Starting in late 2026, Alberta will be the first province to implement the addition of Canadian citizenship markers to our driver's licenses and identification cards. This simple addition will have a profound impact on how Albertans interact with their government and their communities. Why are we doing this? Because we believe in making things better, faster, and more convenient for everyone. By including citizenship information on these cards, we're streamlining access to vital services, whether it's applying for student aid, accessing health benefits, or supporting those with disabilities. No longer will Albertans need to carry multiple documents or face unnecessary hurdles. This change means that when Albertans need to prove both their identity and their citizenship, they'll be able to do so with a single document. It's about reducing red tape, cutting down on paperwork, and making sure that government works for you, not the other way around. Programs like Assured Income for the Severely Handicapped, Alberta Student Aid, and the Persons with Developmental Disabilities program all require proof of citizenship. With this new marker, accessing these supports will be simpler and more secure. Adding a Canadian citizenship marker is also about protecting our democracy. Election security is a vital concern in Canada. By adding citizenship information to Alberta's driver's licenses and ID cards, we're taking a proactive step toward ensuring that only eligible citizens cast ballots in our elections. This helps safeguard the integrity of our electoral process and strengthens trust in our democracy. I also want to be clear that non-citizens, such as permanent residents, that still qualify for Alberta's driver's licenses will not have any marker displayed. Lastly, as we announced several weeks ago, we will also be integrating Alberta healthcare numbers onto driver's licenses, also in late 2026. This will also provide additional security around healthcare numbers, as we have learned through our refocusing of the healthcare system that there are more than 500,000 healthcare numbers registered than there are people living in Alberta. 530,438 to be exact, based on second quarter 2025 population estimates.
Okay, so she does mention some other provincial programs there. What's interesting is that, yeah, you do need to show proof of citizenship for like AISH or Alberta Student Aid, but you don't have to be a citizen. You could also be a permanent resident and qualify for those programs. So for permanent residents, they would still have to show that proof. I guess the government's arguing that it would make it a little bit easier for citizens, which I guess is true. You know, the New Democrats in response called this virtue signaling from the government. It says there are no programs that are exclusively for citizens. So what is the point of this? Again, I think it's more related to that idea of election integrity, something that I think the UCP has identified that their base is concerned about, and it's a bit of a, throwing them a bone here. Like I say, it doesn't appear as though there's a big problem that needs to be solved there. Clearly, there's a cost to making changes to Alberta's driver's license, but it's not the only change happening. So the Alberta government can say we're lumping it in with some other changes, that there's not really a specific cost to this. It's just part of this update and this refresh. Maybe that minimizes those concerns. So that was the announcement on Monday from the Premier, and as mentioned, responding to some questions on some other issues. All right, coming up in just a moment, we will get a little bit more reaction and analysis in the Major Projects Office announcement last week. Adam Legge with the Business Council of Alberta. They've got some thoughts on where things are at, but they've also put out a new report looking ahead to municipal elections in Alberta and hoping to bring some issues to the forefront. To make sure that municipalities in Alberta are taking the right approach when it comes to allowing for development, getting out of the way of business, having business-friendly environments. So we'll talk about some of those issues. We'll talk about Alberta's auto insurance system coming up later on as well. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Very pleased to be joined on the program here this week by Adam Legge, as president of the Business Council of Alberta, businesscouncilab.com. Adam, great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on the show, Rob.
We'll talk about things at the municipal level in a second, but sort of looking federally, I know there was a lot of interest last week as the Prime Minister, speaking at Edmonton, announced some of the first batch, I guess, of projects that are going to be advanced into this Major Projects Office. Let me just get some of your thoughts and reflections on what we heard and maybe what's still to come here.
I would say, Rob, overall, we're generally pleased to see what was announced on the major projects and the initial list. Having said that, there are some things that we think are indicative of longer-term challenges in Canada. I'll get to that in a minute, but I think it's a reflective of a government that finally understands that natural resources are Canada's strategic advantage, and we've seen everything from the LNG Canada Phase 2 project and several copper mines that have been approved. We saw sort of quote-unquote future consideration for the Pathways project, which is a major project for Alberta and a number of our members. But then we're also seeing investments and priorities for trade infrastructure, which we know is critical if we're going to get off the reliance on the U.S. and have a more diversified trading basket of partners, then that's going to be critical. So we're happy to see that. I think it reflected a few things. Now, having said that, what you didn't see was an oil pipeline or certainty around increased production of oil and gas resources. And that's a reflection of the fact the federal government still has not tackled the underlying policy and regulatory problems we have in this country with an oil and gas emissions cap, with Bill C-69, with Bill C-48, the tanker ban moratorium. You cannot, A, grow production significantly in the country for oil and gas, and B, you cannot with certainty create the pipeline infrastructure needed to get that to new markets. So that is why we didn't see that kind of infrastructure. So the federal government does need to tackle those issues and scrap the emissions cap. They need to either repeal or carve out some part of C-48 to enable tankers to come off the West Coast, but to tackle some of the regulatory challenges. And until then, we're not going to see that project that ultimately will be Alberta's biggest opportunity from a resource standpoint.
Yeah, it is interesting. I mean, the creation of the office almost acknowledges that there is dysfunction in the regulatory system, and this is a way to try to bypass it instead of, fundamentally tackling it. There were some hopeful signs, though, I think, on that front, some reports that maybe the oil and gas emissions cap is going to be removed. Certainly the Premier seemed pretty bullish or optimistic following her meeting with the Prime Minister, and there was some signs there that there is that potential link between the Pathways project and a new pipeline. So were you seeing some of those same signs of optimism potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. And in speaking with Premier after the announcement, I think we are likely to see in some short period of time what we've been hoping for, which is sort of a grand bargain, which is something that enables some of either a full repeal or carve-outs and some of that problematic policy like the cap and tanker ban, et cetera, that will enable the Pathways project to go ahead. Not only that, but any other sort of larger infrastructure and growth in our oil and gas production and export of that to new markets. So I think there's something in the works. I would expect to see that we're going to see something more favorable for Alberta and its energy sector. But ultimately, what I don't want to see is that we're doing it project by project as opposed to tackling the full landscape. Canada can't have a bring us a deal and we'll create different conditions for different projects. We can't, that's not a level playing field for investors. That's not going to attract international capital to Canada. We have to create a level playing field, which means scrapping the cap, fixing C-69. We can do these on carve-outs on an intermediate basis or a short-term basis, but long-term, we've got to solve these fundamental problems.
Yeah, definitely. We'll see what more comes from the federal government. Let's talk about municipal governments. We're just on the cusp here of municipal elections across Alberta. The Business Council of Alberta has released a new report, Municipal Matters, to sort of look at how local communities, local governments make decisions that do affect businesses and maybe how we can, change that relationship or build up that relationship. So let's talk about, the aim of this report and why it's important to highlight these issues right now, first of all.
Yeah. Rob, one of the things that we don't do as an organization is get to the local level policy and advocacy. But what I did hear from my members all across the province, from the north to the south to big cities to rural communities, was that they're concerned about the state of their local governments and what they are not doing in terms of supporting business and the priorities that business has as a critical stakeholder in investment in the community, job creation, tax revenues, et cetera. And so what we did is we sort of up-leveled everything and created a project and a report that's city, community agnostic, but really tackles the fundamental common issues you're seeing in every community across Alberta. And so what we found are really two key findings. One is that the business community does not feel valued as a critical stakeholder, that they are not engaged, they are not listened to, they are not valued. And secondly, that the priorities that they feel are most important aren't being tackled by their local governments. And that's things like crime and safety, that's efficient planning and development, that's leadership and stewardship of governance and the financial resources in communities. And so what we really want to do is just say, hey, all of you candidates out there, whether you're in Grand Prairie or you're in the municipal district of Foothills or whether you're in Calgary, Edmonton, or Lethbridge, these are the fundamental priorities that business leaders in Alberta want you to pay attention to.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because, the issues around crime and disorder, and that stood out to me because we don't tend to think of those as business issues. And I think there are concerns that the general public has, but these are shared concerns and shared interests that businesses feel the impact of those issues in so many ways.
Rob, many of my members who operate in the big cities of Calgary and Edmonton have concerns about what they're seeing on social disorder in the streets of downtowns. To some degree, they have staff that are concerned for their safety in going to work in the downtown offices. We also have members in rural communities who are operating retail operations, who are having their storefronts vandalized and products stolen out of their shops. So it ranges from the big cities to the small communities. we recognize that this is a complex issue. It's wrapped around issues of mental health and addictions and homelessness, et cetera. And so this is not a just let's throw more police on the street. We have to have some wraparound supports. We talk about that in the report. We also recognize this is not just the local governments. They have to work with the other two senior levels of government. This is all of government, all three levels have to work together to change everything from bail reform to presence on the street at the local level.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned permitting, and that's such an important step for any business. And when talking about regulations that exist provincially, federally, that all has an impact. But there is so much that rests at the municipal level that has such an impact on businesses. I guess permitting and all of that red tape is a big part of that, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, whether it's enabling housing to be built fast enough, whether it's getting projects developed, whether it's major traffic infrastructure, all of these things are taking longer than they should. Some of them are unclear. Some of them, you have two communities that are adjacent to each other that have very different approaches. So it can be hard to work municipally and jurisdictionally. There are some real great advances in technology, artificial intelligence, and large language models that can help streamline some of those projects that have very similar characteristics to previous ones. So we can cut time through that really governments should be adopting to enable the process to be faster, more efficient. There's also a belief that there's just, like every city in Canada, that there's just too much of a cash grab at the local level to the developer, which then gets passed on to typically the homeowner. And that is what is driving a large proportion of the housing cost increase in the country. So let's look at efficiency. Let's look at comparing ourselves to other jurisdictions. Let's make sure that we're making everything as seamless and efficient and affordable as possible.
What about the taxation side? I know there's been concern, certainly in the big cities, about the perceived imbalance between residential and non-residential taxes, and that's a real dilemma for local governments. But how does that need to be addressed, and what are the concerns of businesses on the taxation side?
I think many businesses feel that they pay an outsized proportion of the tax revenue to communities, but they actually have a lower burden and demand on the public services. So you and I as residential taxpayers, we use the streets and we use garbage collection, we use parks, etc. Businesses aren't using that. Their employees are, but their employees are paying that through their own residential property taxes. And so what the business feels is they're kind of, to some degree, a bit of a cash cow for that. We have seen some good progress, particularly in the city of Calgary, about trying to rebalance that residential to non-residential tax ratio, but it's still too high. And the reality is that businesses don't vote. Residents vote. So businesses don't get the ability to weigh in and provide input and guidance to city council on the critical issues and what that balance should be, because they're not voters. They just basically sit back and take the property tax rate that's developed by the cities and the communities, and have to pay that. And it's an imbalanced weight on the business community. And businesses are quite happy to contribute to a good quality of life in their communities. It helps with employee satisfaction and retention, but we need to recalibrate that a bit to put less demand on business because they aren't using as many of the public services and amenities.
Right. But that's the thing. We need that development. We need businesses to start up. We need businesses to grow. And so, as much as we can think of citizens versus businesses as though they're separate interests. I mean, it's kind of, we all have a vested interest in providing that kind of atmosphere and environment where businesses can thrive. It benefits everybody.
You're absolutely right, Rob. And in no way are our members saying they don't want to contribute to the quality of our cities and our communities. By no means are they saying that at all. They just want to make sure it's appropriately balanced. And they also are extremely strong contributors to many of the charitable and community-based activities. You look in larger centers and we see many of our arts and culture supported by the corporate sector. In many smaller communities, you'll see hometown parades and Christmas festivals and Lions clubs, all supported by, at ice rinks, supported by some of the local businesses. And so we have to take all of that into consideration, but businesses invested in making their communities strong and vibrant. And the ask in this report really is to local governments, hey, let's engage more. Let's consider us partners in the success and the vibrancy and the prosperity of our communities. We have concerns, we have issues, we have ideas in which we can contribute. Let's work more closely together, because right now there seems to just be a lack of engagement and connection with the business community that's so vital to success and prosperity in our communities.
And as you say, this report's not about endorsing anything or anybody, or even as a platform per se, but I guess it's about facilitating a conversation, perhaps. What do you hope comes of that?
Well, you're absolutely right. We don't endorse any candidates or anything like that. In fact, we don't even make recommendations at any city or community level. So it's just a message to all candidates out there, and ultimately after October 20th, when those governments are formed, that these are the priorities of business, and really an ask and a reach out to say, we have ideas, we have a desire to connect and engage with you, we have a desire to continue to participate in the vibrancy and prosperity of our communities. Let's work together. Whether it's creating a business advisory task force for city councils, whether it's having steering committees, whether it's engaging on specific issues, whether it's building and permit development, or whether it's crime and safety in the downtowns, all of those things, working with local officials, planning departments, police departments, etc. We're just asking that local governments see business as a valued stakeholder and bring us into the fold.
All right, much more, including this report, Municipal Matters. It's all up at businesscouncilab.com. Adam, thank you so much for making some time for us here today. Really appreciate this.
My pleasure, Rob. Anytime.
All right, so once again, that was Adam Legge, as president of the Business Council of Alberta. Again, their website, businesscouncilab.com. Coming up in just a moment, we're going to get into the issue of auto insurance, and this has proven to be a real tricky one for this government and really for successive Alberta governments. And finding that sweet spot, finding that balance where you've got private companies who want to be in Alberta offering auto insurance, where you've got a system where it's affordable for Alberta drivers, or certainly at least for good drivers, but you've also still got a system where Albertans' legal rights are respected, where you've still got some resource to go to courts and get recourse if you've been injured by the fault of somebody else, by a negligent driver. So, as I say, this has proven tricky for this government. They've chosen a course of action that they're calling the Care First approach, which others would describe really as a version of what's known as no-fault insurance. With premiums still going up, nobody seems happy. The Premier even now threatening to go to a public system if we can't get all of this sorted out. So coming up in just a moment, someone who has followed all of this very closely, Mark McCourt, is an Edmonton-based automobile accident injury lawyer, principal counsel with McCourt Law Offices in Edmonton. We'll get some thoughts from him on where things stand and maybe where things are going or really ought to be going in Alberta on this front. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Well, still a lot of questions about the future of auto insurance in Alberta, as the Alberta government is moving toward what it calls its Care First model, which is really more or less what's known as no-fault auto insurance. Now you've got, though, the insurance industry, some companies threatening to leave Alberta, the Alberta government even threatening maybe to go to a public model. So joining us to try to sort out all of this, very pleased to welcome to the program Mark McCourt. He's an automobile accident injury lawyer. He's also principal counsel with McCourt Law Offices in Edmonton, much more at McCourtlaw.ca. Mark, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks for having me on, Rob.
It's an interesting moment, isn't it? Because the Alberta government says they're trying to fix auto insurance, but it just feels like maybe things are going in the opposite direction. What's the lay of the land right now as you see it, first of all?
Well, I know that when Danielle Smith's UCP government was I guess, reelected. I mean, Premier Smith took over for Jason Kenney, but was reelected in May of 2023. The Premier appointed Nate Horner to the Finance Department and gave him a mandate letter that said, amongst other things, hey, can you try to figure out how we can get people's car insurance premiums down? And so his department went to work, and the reality is this, that for the last 15 years or so, there are maybe a handful of insurance policy bureaucrats in the finance department that have been itching to find some finance minister who would let them bring in no-fault auto insurance. It's kind of a hobby horse that a handful of them have had, and with Travis Taves before Mr. Horner and with Joe Ceci before Travis Taves. They weren't able to find, quite frankly, in my opinion, a finance minister dupable enough to go for this. But they finally have one in Nate Horner, and so they've decided to go ahead with this Care First program that initially was supposed to save everybody about $400 a year on their car insurance premiums, and now it seems like, well, actually, maybe it's going to cost somewhere between about $136 to $400 a year in auto insurance premiums, which is really quite the opposite of what they were aiming for, I think.
Right. Yeah. I think you're right. They don't want to call it no-fault insurance. They're using this term Care First, but I think that's more or less what we're talking about here. So what do we mean when we say no-fault insurance?
So basically, if under the current at-fault insurance system, also called a tort law system, if you get rear-ended by somebody and you hurt your neck or some such thing, then you can bring a personal injury claim against that negligent driver's car insurance company. And so on some occasions, of course, you might call somebody like myself, a personal injury lawyer, and I've when I get a call from somebody, I have a couple of questions for them. Question number one: was it your fault? And if they say yep, I say, that's all the questions I have for you, because if it was your fault, there's not much I can do for you. But if they say it was not my fault, it was somebody else's fault, and I got hurt, then you've got a claim you can bring against the negligent driver's insurance company. Now, under a no-fault system, it doesn't matter whose fault the car accident is. You could be the reckless driver who caused an accident, and if as a result of that accident, you, the reckless driver, get hurt, then you are entitled to the exact same compensation that your victim, perhaps that you may have mowed down at a crosswalk, what have you. You're entitled to that same compensation scheme that your innocent victim has. Now, currently, under the existing program, auto insurance system, there is a no-fault aspect to this. Everybody's standard auto policy carries mandatory accident benefits coverage that provides you with Care First in the event of a car accident, and so we already have a Care First aspect to the existing system. I doubt that Mr. Horner was aware of that, but now he knows.
Interesting. And we already have in Alberta too, don't we? There are limits on injury payouts.
Yeah, well, absolutely.
Injuries.
Yeah, so there's a soft tissue injury cap that's been in place since October of 2004. Ralph Klein's government brought in what they called a minor injury regulation that covers sprains and strains and whiplash injuries that heal relatively quickly. And so that's a cap on pain and suffering compensation that initially was at $4,000, and with inflation, it's a little under $6,200 now. And then, frankly, there's an overall cap on compensation for pain and suffering. Back in 1978, the Supreme Court of Canada heard 3 cases of very catastrophically injured individuals and said, these people should be entitled to compensation for their pain and suffering from the person that harmed them or from their insurer. And so they said, well, I mean, there's no amount of dollars that can properly compensate somebody who's been catastrophically injured, is rendered a quadriplegic, et cetera. But we're the Supreme Court of Canada. We got to pick a number here. And so they picked $100,000. And so $100,000 in 1978 dollars, which might be closing in on about $400,000, is kind of that ultimate cap for pain and suffering compensation.
Right.
So there's already limits, like you say, Rob. Yeah.
Yeah. So what do you make of the argument that somehow these payouts or these court cases are still a problem, or still what's costing the insurance companies money, and therefore that's why rates are going up?
It sounds like a really good line, and all you have to do, though, is look at the stats to see that is not, in fact, the case. When the UCP government was initially elected in 2019 under Jason Kenney, Mr. Kenney's campaign chair became immediately after the election became a lobbyist for the Insurance Bureau of Canada. His former press secretary is now the president of the Insurance Bureau of Canada, and they immediately went to work on getting rid of that dirty, rotten NDP cap on premiums. and then went to work on persuading the Kenney government at the time to look at further restrictions on the amount that people hurt by reckless drivers could charge. And so Mr. Kenney's Finance Minister Travis Toews listened to a number of their concerns, of the insurance industry's concerns. And as a result, while premiums over that period of time, over the roughly 4 or 5 years since 2019 until Mr. Kenney's departure, went up by about 35%. Claims costs for bodily injury claims went down by about 8%. And so, to blame out of control injury claims on why auto insurance premiums have gone up is just simply not true. Now, more recent data shows that last year, while bodily injury claims did rise, they rose by about 6.5%. What really went sky high was collision comprehensive hail damage claims, which the claims costs more than doubled for auto insurers. And so, if auto insurance companies were being honest, they'd say the big problem here is out of control hail damage, theft claims, that sort of thing. That's where we're seeing, as an insurance industry, where they're seeing a huge increase in claims, and so perhaps something could be done about that. But that's I think basically, and Nate Horner said this in the press conference announcing this Care First or No Fault system last November. He said, people driving $100,000 F-150, people who parked at the Calgary airport about a year ago and saw a big hailstorm that caused about $1 billion damage. And Mr. Horner said, you could scarcely find more expensive vehicles in an airport anywhere outside of Dubai. I think really that's what he's looking at, is trying to help the insurance industry artificially keep artificially low the comprehensive coverage and hail damage coverage for people driving Bentleys and $100,000 vehicles at the expense of people who might be victimized by reckless drivers.
Yeah, that's the thing. And I guess even if we're seeing premiums increase under this no-fault model, I mean, that should tell us something too, shouldn't it?
Well, it's very unfortunate that if Danielle Smith's mandate to Finance Minister Horner was find a way to reduce auto insurance premiums, well, his bureaucrats led him astray. They told him that if you bring in this Care First model, which is basically a no-fault model, it will reduce auto insurance premiums. Frankly, injury lawyers such as myself and to the credit, even insurance lobbyists were saying, you know what, no-fault insurance is not the way to go. And a little over a year ago, the trial lawyers and the insurance industry came to some consensus conclusions on how the Alberta government could reduce premiums while maintaining the existing at-fault system. And the bureaucrats, I guess, must have convinced Finance Minister Horner that no, stay on target. You gotta bring in this no fault. We're telling you this is the best thing since sliced bread. And they weren't able to convince Travis Toews when he was Finance Minister, but they managed to convince Horner of this. And your colleague at the Calgary Herald, Rick Bell, talked to Danielle Smith about a week ago, and she said, you know what? I'm getting fed up with this insurance file. The insurance industry and the trial lawyers better figure out how we can fix this thing. Well, guess what? The insurance industry and the trial lawyers told the government how to fix this thing a little over a year ago, and the finance department ignored us.
So what would that look like then?
Well, so basically, what the insurance industry a number of years ago had been pitching was three main things. Number one, if you can eliminate minor injuries from the at-fault insurance model, that would save a couple $100 a year in premiums for the average motorist. And then there was a couple other things. They said, number one, if you could get rid of this grid system under which good drivers artificially over-subsidize the insurance rates of bad drivers, that would save something like about $65 a year. And then there there was one other thing that that escapes me right now. I think it was, but in any event, they said that was going to save another roughly $60 a year, and so for a total of $320 or $325 a year in savings. And then the Alberta Civil Trial Lawyers Association said, you know what? Why don't we throw in getting rid of that direct compensation property damage scheme that Jason Kenney's government brought in at the beginning of 2022. Under that scheme, no matter whose fault a car accident is, your own insurance company pays for your vehicle damage if you have collision coverage, and if the accident is not your fault, they pay under this DCPD scheme. But by bringing in this direct compensation property damage, people's basic auto insurance premiums rose because of that. So the Civil Trial Lawyers Association said, hey, if you get rid of that DCPD scheme, if you allow optional collision coverage where people could opt to get their vehicles fixed with aftermarket parts or basic parts, that would save another roughly, I think they said something in the area of $400 a year for car insurance premiums. So these were solutions that were put to the government back in June of 2024, and the bureaucrats said, you know what, let's just stay on target, Nate. We can bring in this care first, and it's going to be transformational. It's going to be a culture shift for Albertans who until recently, valued things like, rights and responsibilities. But let's change the culture in Alberta. I'm not a big fan of that idea.
Well, then you had the Premier, following in those comments she made to Rick Bell, suggesting that she might just rip it all up and implement a public system like what we see in Saskatchewan or in British Columbia. What did you make of that?
Well, number one, I think she's bluffing. Frankly, provinces that go to a public auto insurance system tend to be socialist governments. You typically see an NDP type government or a very left-leaning liberal type government to bring in a public auto insurance system. Not that I'm saying that it's necessarily a bad idea. Public auto insurance system would eliminate profit from the equation and would reduce people's car insurance premiums, but again, it tends to be a more left-leaning government that brings that in, and so I doubt she's. I think she's just trying to scare the insurance industry that keeps whining for yet more handouts. But I frankly don't think the auto insurance industry is they're gonna call it bluff. I don't think that they believe that the UCP government is seriously considering bringing in a public auto insurer.
As you say, there is an off-ramp here if she wants the lawyers in the industry to come up with something. As you laid out, there is a model there, a proposal there, or do you think they're bound to this care first, this no-fault model? Where do you see things going here?
Yeah, you're right, Rob. There is an off-ramp. There's been an off-ramp for over a year. I myself have added some other suggestions that would further increase the savings for good Alberta motorists on their auto insurance premiums. And so I've been pointing out to the government that for over the last 18 months that there is an off-ramp that they could take. Whether they're going to do that or not remains to be seen. I think another option that they have, and that sadly it seems like they're considering, is one thing the insurance lobby is saying is there's this 7.5% annual rate cap for good Alberta motorists right now. Right. And if you could please remove that rate cap so we could charge whatever the heck we wanted, it would really help us out because we're having a tough time making ends meet. I think the Alberta government might do that. And as crazy as it seems, here's the political expediency of doing something like that. You raise, if they were to remove that rate cap, and in 2026, everybody saw their premiums go up by an average of 25 or 30%. Let's say $600 or $700 a year. And then in 2027, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Rob, I think that might be an election year, they brought in this care first and said to insurance companies, can you do us a solid, you guys, and knock everybody's premiums down by $100 a year or $200 a year? it could well be that Albertans who have perhaps short memories, or at least this would be the game plan for the UCP, would not remember the $700 rate hike they saw in 2026, but they would be very happy that the UCP brought in this Care First and gave them $200 off their auto insurance premiums in 2027. So that might be something they do. I wouldn't recommend it. I hope they don't do that. I would rather they take the off ramp and do something that would actually be helpful for all Albertans, but you never can tell. Tough to know what the future what the future lies in terms of the road ahead.
Indeed. We'll just have to wait and see for ourselves, I guess. Much more in the meantime, McCourtlaw.ca. Mark, appreciate your insight on this. Thanks so much for making some time for us here.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. Good talking to you.
All right. Once again, that was Mark McCourt, accident injury lawyer based in Edmonton, principal counsel at McCourt Law Offices. Again, McCourtlaw.ca. So we'll see what the Alberta government decides to do here. Stick on this current course of pursuing this new auto insurance policy, maybe go in a different direction, or as the Premier has suggested, it will just throw out the system entirely and switch to a public system. But that would be costly. That would be a lot of turmoil. I don't know how serious the Premier is. I guess we shall see. Our thanks as well to Adam Legge, President of the Business Council of Alberta. We will leave it there for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Don't forget, coming up on Wednesday, new episode of the Line Alberta podcast for you. You can find that at alberta.readtheline.ca. We'll have another episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show coming up on Friday. Conversation with writer, former broadcaster David Cayley, who's written a new book. It's called The CBC, How Canada's Public Broadcaster Lost Its Voice and How to Get It Back. So we'll have that and much more for you coming up on Friday. Don't forget our website. It's robbreakenridge.ca. Thanks again for joining us here, folks, and we'll talk to you later this week. Take care.